Greetings, everyone. I'm Larry Williams, the Director of CARMA, the Consortium for the Advancement of Research Methods and Analysis, currently hosted at the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. You may know that CARMA is an academic center devoted to research methods education in the area of management and organizational studies. In addition to hosting our in-person short courses at several locations around the world, we also have our internet-based program, our webcast program, which we've been hosting since 2004. And so in addition, through this program, we have people visit campus and give a lecture on a research methods topic in an area that they're working in. And what I like to do, in addition to hosting the lecture, is to have a chat with them to get to know them better so that you can get to know them better and learn about their issues related to teaching and research and education. And so we call these the Meet the Methodologist session, and it's my pleasure to welcome Myles Shaver back to CARMA and express my appreciation to you, Myles, for taking the time to chat with us today.
Thanks a lot, Larry.
Yep. So Myles received his PhD from the University of Michigan, and from there joined the faculty at Stern at New York University. A few years later moved to the University of Minnesota, where he is now professor and Pond Family Chair in Teaching and Advancement of Free Enterprise Principles. During his career, Myles has received many awards, including being recognized recently in an article about the world's 50 best business school professors. Myles has a new book out on the headquarters economy. You may know him for his substantive research in areas like international expansion, mergers and acquisition, and investment location choices. But today he's with us to talk about his interest in research methods and to give us a preview. I mentioned before, Myles has given a webcast lecture before in spring of 2006 when we were at Virginia Commonwealth University about 4 jobs ago. And so it's good to see you again, Myles, and appreciate again you taking the time to chat with us. So over the course of your career, in addition to your many substantive accomplishments in the areas that you work in, you've had an underlying interest as well in methods and analysis. And so where did this come from, for lack of a better way of saying it?
Yeah, no, I think where it all starts is the main reason that, I got into this profession and being a business school professor is I really believe the importance of evidence-based management research. And if we're going to take the evidence, that's really what research methods are, is the ability to take data and make sense of it and try and get correct inference out of it. And so I think that if one believes in evidence-based management, it just sort of naturally follows that one should have an interest in research methods.
Yep. Yeah, we kind of need to have some rules, basically, kind of to spin on that. We need to have rules as to what constitutes evidence.
No, exactly. And then, through this process, and I really had the advantage of having some fantastic professors when it came to research methods, and that when I was in grad school. And one of the things that you begin to learn is, research methods and the approach, these are tools. And like all tools, there's certain jobs that they're good for, and there's certain jobs that they're not good for. And beginning to have that understanding and beginning to then appreciate that, a tool in the hands of a craftsman who knows what they're doing is really powerful.
Yeah.
A tool in the hands of someone who doesn't know what they're doing can be really dangerous. Yes. And so sorting those out, that's my interest comes down to that.
Yeah, and I think the one thing it's about methods and analysis tools is that for a lot of people when they're in grad school, they just think, okay, I've got these couple of courses, I'm going to learn what I need to know, and once I've learned that, that'll be everything I need to know the rest of my career. But once you get out and start trying to publish and you realize how things change and evolve, it's really helpful to have the right attitude about it. Well, so how has this interest in your research methods and data analysis tools, because you have that, how do you think that impacts your work as a substantive researcher?
Yeah, no, I think, probably one of the biggest example that I can give. So, I wrote a paper that people will refer to begin, that really, and think in many ways, began the discussion of accounting for endogeneity in strategy research. And, a lot of people consider that, oh, this is a research methods issue. And it is, but in writing that paper, the bigger understanding for me is this is not a research methods issue. This is a conceptual issue, right? So that if companies are choosing what they do, trying to be able to sort that out from, just saying that a relationship between variables are cause and effect, well, that substantively affected my research going forward. And in particular, it was anytime I see a relationship, it could be what I'm looking for, but I've learned to spend a lot of time thinking, well, what else could generate that? Yeah. And, that sort of discipline or insight to always be thinking what else could be there, that has had a huge substantive effect on the questions I ask and the research that I've done.
Yeah. Oh, that's so timely that you mentioned that. I was just teaching a group yesterday, and we talk about the basic research model and the pursuit of alternative explanations. And I say, that if there's any one kind of value system that you have to have that will make you successful, it's that constant pursuit of alternative explanations. And I try to warn them that it's tough, because the psychology is all there to look only for confirming evidence, so.
I couldn't agree with you more. And, that's really, for me, that's the really practical issue and the whole sort of focus in our discussion of causal identification and sort of the identification revolutions that have moved through social science. That's what it's all about is, what do we see? It could be consistent with what we think is happening. And over time, do we become more and more refined in trying to tease out that, yeah, it really is what we think is happening versus things that could be really plausible, and have we thought hard about those?
Yeah. I think of it as the, a lot of times we think about the impact of being a methods person on one's substantive research about, so you learn how to analyze data better. But I also think there's an important role going the other way, where those substantive issues really help us frame the methods issues that follow as we try to untangle some substantive phenomena, and we realize that we come up against some uncertainty or ambiguity about the best way to do that. So,
no, I fully agree with you, and it's really, the discussion that I'll have, especially with my PhD students as they move on over time, is, there really begins to be this interplay both, within a particular paper, but especially over one's career, of going back and forth between what do I see in the data, what do I infer, what type of questions does that pose for me going forward, what types of theories do I need to answer those questions. I think it's a really iterative process.
Yeah. Hey, let me shift gears a little bit. So I noticed your title includes mention of teaching, and I think for a lot of junior people, they look at people like yourself that are having these fantastic research careers, but who also, by being a high-profile prof in a business school, there are a lot of pressures in the classroom, both credit and non-credit. How have you learned to balance those two?
Well, I think to a large extent I've been fortunate. So when I first went to NYU, I was able to teach a class. I taught a class on international strategy. And that's really the sweet spot of my research.
Mm-hmm.
And so this ability to be able to, go into the classroom and talk about a phenomena that I know something about, but also understanding MBA students aren't going to want to engage with it the same way that my PhD students or colleagues have. I've always found, I've been able to have this relationship so that they aren't different things. And in fact, this importance of keeping research and my teaching similar and this overlap, I think that that's had a substantive effect in my research over time. So after I left NYU and I moved to Minnesota, I wasn't teaching international management anymore.
Mm-hmm.
I was teaching, corporate strategy. And I was doing some of that at NYU, but international was always part. What's interesting is if I look back now at my scholarship, as my teaching moved out of international, so did my research.
Uh-huh.
And it was sort of, in retrospect, it's very natural, I think, because what I was thinking about day to day as I went into the classroom, or the types of issues I was thinking about as I was reading the business press or thinking about this, the focus was less on international, and the curiosities were these other issues. And then that's where my research went. So yeah. I find them extremely complementary. And in fact, what I'm teaching often drives questions that I find puzzling and drives my research in many ways.
Yeah, yeah. And, and for me, there have been many times where I have taught the same thing over and over and over again, but yet when I go in to teach it, the process of trying to explain it, or maybe it's a question in the class, leads me to see things in a little bit different way, and that can be an inspiration for a research idea as well.
No, absolutely. And like I say, I'm a fundamental believer that the strength of a business school in a university is this notion of what's evidence-based research that affects management. And so to be able to, take questions that students have or approach them with, there are areas where we understand some things and areas where we maybe don't as well. That's an important part of the conversation, and I think that that's very much a nice overlap between research and teaching.
Yep. Well, you've been at it, both teaching and research, for 25 some years, and that's the history of academic research and management, whether it's OB or strategy or international business. That is a really important time period in the evolution of that discipline. So I was wondering, if you kind of try to step back and think about the field and how it has changed from the empirical research, how have you seen it evolve in your career in terms of methods and analysis and changes over that 25-year period?
Yeah, no, it certainly has changed. If I reflect back to even things that I would read when I was in grad school, a couple characterizations. First of all, in part because of data limitations, and that most strategy research was very cross-sectional in nature.
Mm-hmm.
Over time, we've seen an explosion of, more panel-based research, more longitudinal research, as both data availability and tools in that have increased. So that's one important change. The other thing, too, is especially early on, and I think it reflects also the nascency of the strategy field, there were a lot of methods that were largely sort of descriptive or categorizing.
Mm-hmm.
So things like cluster analysis, just sort of due to the natures of the theories of strategic groups and those types of things. And we tend not to see those anymore, or very rarely. And we move more now to methods, of course, to deal with panels, deal, with data that we didn't have before, much larger data sets. But I think the most fundamental change over time, and like I say, I think it's a change that we've seen in social science disciplines in general, is as that's evolved, much more on this notion of focusing on causal inference.
Mm-hmm.
And so, it wouldn't be unusual when I think about when I started the structure of a paper was, I'm going to hypothesize a relationship for two variables. and let me tell you 7 different reasons why they should correlate with each other. So market share and profitability should be positively related to each other, and here's 10 different reasons. Going back to this notion of, well, if we really want to have evidence-based research to inform managers or policymakers, knowing which one of those reasons is happening becomes really important. And that's the notion of causal inference. And that's what I want to talk about when we get together is how should we be thinking about causal inference, especially given work in strategy and organizations where it's just going to be really hard to do given the nature of what we study, what we care about, what our data look like. But how should we go about thinking about it?
Yeah. Well, and going back to the paper you mentioned earlier on mediation, I mean, that's basically what drives our interest in mediation, is measuring those variables and trying to quantify and understand their role. So, I do talk to some strategy folks, and over the years, it seems like it's a common comment that strategy research have too little interest in measurement. Now, to be fair, I say that I talk to some strategy folks. Oftentimes, it's the micro people who are dominated by measurement who are the ones that are making those comments. But nevertheless, do you think that's a fair criticism?
I think, like most comments like that, there's elements of truth, and then there's also sort of a context to put it in to maybe be a little bit more forgiving. And let me mention what I mean by both of those. So one is, in some ways, the phenomena that we study are the phenomena that we study. There is such a thing as profits. It's not performance might be intangible, but profits are defined better. Or a strategic action like merging companies. Well, they're merged or they're not, right? There is nuance, but measurement is pretty straightforward there. So in part, given what people are measuring versus things like, attitudes or motivation or that, there's a different requirement when it comes to measurement. Some of these are just definitional in some ways. At the same time, I think that especially as we've moved on to caring more about causal identification, it's been very consistent in the macro literatures and the strategy literatures that we're trying to infer underlying theoretical mechanisms by things that are not really close to what is measured. So company characteristics, it's supposed to measure motivation and that. And I do think that one of the tools that we don't use, but we really could use, is focusing more on measurement to get to issues of causal identification and what we do. And for that reason, I think measuring or getting closer to our phenomena is one way forward.
Yeah. I mentioned your paper on mediation from your earlier presentation. Now you've moved on to moderation, and I know that you have a paper that's either in press or recently out that looks at moderating effects. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, so this is a paper, so again, as we discussed before, this evolution in terms of methods that we see in our field. We've moved to a lot of panel methods, so things like fixed effect estimators people will have heard. Many people will understand them. And the key thing about fixed effect estimators is the idea of fixed effects is now we're using within, and I'm talking about this as a strategy person, we use within firm variation to identify coefficient estimates instead of a cross-firm variation. And that's really advantageous for ruling out certain spurious relationships because it means a variable has to be changing, the outcome has to be changing at the same time. We're getting closer to cause and effect. The notion of the paper is, as soon as I estimate a model like that has an interaction term, I think not well known to anybody is I'm no longer only identifying coefficient estimates within firm variation. So as soon as you put an interaction term in a fixed effect model, that interaction term could well be picking up cross-sectional variation. And it's a fixed effect model. It shouldn't be doing that, but just due to the nature of the estimate or the estimator, that's actually what happens. So the notion of the paper is to bring this up. I can demonstrate it happens in simulations. I can show it happens in data. And
so what, I got to ask, man, so what prompted the awareness of this, or what got you moving on this topic?
Yeah, well, it's one of these things as I'd be sitting in seminars or listening to papers or reading them. And again, it's like, oh, you know, this is a nice research design. This person's thinking carefully. They're identifying their model with within-firm variation. And then I'm like, how could you get that much within-firm variation to identify a coefficient estimate like this in interaction? It's just that I don't think that that's...
It just doesn't add up.
I don't understand this.
Yeah.
And especially people getting within-firm estimates on, well, interactions of variables with themselves. So a U-shaped relationship. It's like, yeah, if you take a look at the U that they're estimating, there's no way any firm is changing that much within this panel. And I was wondering, how could we get these estimates?
So it kind of begins with what seemed like kind of anomalous or unusual findings then. So did you then have to go dig into the equations to try to figure out if you could understand it that way?
Yeah, that was the first step, was to dig into the equations. And the first thing sort of figure out is, yeah, just a little underlying math. It's like, okay, this is, I think we're not getting here what people think we're getting here. And then just sort of keeping it at the analytical level, I think you could demonstrate it, but it became much more powerful as, well, let me generate data where, you know, I could control the variation within firm, I could control the variation across firm, and just show that you hold within firm variation constant and you increase the cross-sectional variation, yeah, coefficient estimates identify and become much stronger. There's an effect in there most people think isn't in there.
Yep. And is it the kind of thing where you can pursue with a reanalysis using a different method that also makes the point?
Yes, and so it becomes
data.
Yeah. So what I suggest, or the way forward is, you know, rather than just the interaction, it's segmenting the data, right? So subsamples, you know, we should see variation. That's not going to be susceptible to the same concern. And so personally, I often like splitting samples when we have, you know, these moderating or interaction effects, because often I think it leads to more straightforward interpretations, but it also, there's an advantage here, especially in these within firm estimates or panel data models, is they're not going to succumb to this sort of inference of cross-sectional variation the same way.
Okay. Well, geez, that sounds like something I'd like to have for a CARMA lecture as well. But instead, you're going to be talking on a different topic. So tell us a little bit about your upcoming lecture.
Yeah, and so what I want to talk about, it really comes back to this revolution through lots of social sciences, this notion of that we should care about causal identification. And, you know, the idea of, as we all know, establishing cause and effect, well, that's a really high standard, especially when we're in non-experimental settings. But nevertheless, this has been the push in research in lots of different disciplines. I want to look at it especially from the lens of management and organization research. And I think why should we care about this? And I really think we should. At the same time, we can't care so much about it that it affects the questions that we ask. And what I mean by that is, you know, people will think about field experiments or these exogenous shocks to help give us identification. At the same time, if we only go looking for those and stop pursuing important questions where they're really hard to find, like mergers and acquisitions and these other messy but important topics, that's going to be at the detriment to our field. So I want to talk about why we care about it, why it's problematic or difficult to do in strategy and organization research, and then suggest how maybe we should go about balancing these two demands. and in particular highlight there's a number of research norms out there in our profession, especially in management, that I think restrict us or impede us from making progress as a profession in addressing these questions. So I'll talk about those and maybe some things we could do what I think is a little bit better.
Oh man, you mentioned research storms. Can you just give me a little taste of what you're talking about?
Yeah, so I'll pick on my favorite one here.
Okay.
So one of the things I want to highlight is I think that when you deal with fields where you have these complex phenomena, no one paper is ever going to identify things perfectly. Mm-hmm. How we're going to build to causal identification is through a cumulative body of research. So we're going to look at a problem. If it's an important problem, we should look at it lots of ways. Smart people are going to find ingenious or better ways to identify it than what we've done before. Once we have this common understanding, we'll have evidence-based research to talk to managers. Now, one of the problems in our field, I think, that prevents this is there is this research norm that every paper requires novel theory.
Uh-huh.
Well, what does that mean? That means whoever proposed the theory or the hypothesis and tested it, they got it right the first time. We're done.
Yeah.
And even better than that, those who actually wrote a conceptual piece and proposed it but didn't test it, well, we can't revisit that because empirically looking at that is not novel theory.
Novel contribution.
Right. So we've got that right with zero evidence. Mm-hmm. I take issue with that, and I don't think that that's necessarily good for our profession and not necessarily good for understanding the difficulty of even those who, advance things, do good tests. Those can't be the final word.
Yeah. Oh, that's intriguing. That'll be, I guess it's maybe 2 weeks from tomorrow, April the 12th. You'll be visiting Lincoln to give your webcast. Hey, let me close just with a couple of personal things, if I may.
Sure.
So what do you do to relax and have fun?
Hang out with my kids.
Yeah, I know you mentioned you have
those types of things. Yep. And
so do you have fun things that you do particularly enjoy doing with them?
Yeah, no, so like I say, heading outside, going hiking, those types of things, that's a fun thing. I think the other thing too that has become my hobby over time is cooking, and especially pulling out the smoker.
Oh.
And
now that's a pretty time-consuming process to smoke something, right?
But that's true. But here's why I think why this has become the hobby of choice is so much of what we do, the time disconnect between inputs and outputs is huge.
Uh-huh.
And 8 to 10 hours on a smoker, well, that's pretty close. So effort and feedback are pretty immediate when it comes to sort of cooking and barbecuing. And so for that reason, I think that's why that's become my hobby.
Well, that's that kind of food preparation is particularly tasty. So final question I've started asking people just because it's fun. Is there something about yourself that most people and your local colleagues or friends in the profession wouldn't know about? Maybe talents, hobbies, other than your smoking meat?
Well, that was going to be my answer to it. That's sort of the secret one that people are sometimes a little bit surprised about. So.
Yeah. Well, so then, do you have a particular kind of meat that you like to smoke?
And so it's for me. I think the focus in particular is the baby back ribs.
Yeah. Well, I will hope to someday have the opportunity to test the fruits of your labor. So, hey, listen, I know it's your spring break, busy time of year. I want to thank you for taking the time to chat, and really appreciative of your willingness to make another contribution to CARMA in a couple of weeks. So we'll very much look forward to hosting your webcast. Thank you, Myles Shaver. Enjoy your day, dude.
Yeah, no, thanks a lot, man. Looking forward to it.
All right, we'll see you soon. Thanks.